Good afternoon, everyone. It's a joy to be with you once again to break open the scriptures, and a joy to be with you as we welcome members of the LGBTQ community who may be joining us for the first time. We welcome you, and we are delighted that you are being a part of this faith community and our faith experience. Before we can unpack its riches, this weekend's gospel presents us with an intriguing challenge, namely, what's the title of the story? A narrative's title tells us the drama's focal point, that is, to where and to what we should direct our attention. And in this case, there are a variety of options. Some commentators call this episode The Healing of the 10 Lepers. The title is accurate enough. It describes the actions present in the gospel. It highlights the ancient dread of various skin disfigurations and Jesus' mission as an agent of sacred healing. As a title such as this draws our attention to our own needs for healing and our summons to be healers for the ills of one another. Others call this narrative the thankful leper or the grateful Samaritan. These titles draw our attention to the importance of gratitude. They highlight how only one of the 10 was moved enough to return and give thanks for being healed and restored to the possibility of human contact and communion. Such titles underscore a summons to be aware of all that is gift in our lives. They exhort us to notice the things that we take for granted. And this is a good lesson and a valuable one in our fast-paced world, to be sure. But these titles and interpretations make the gospel a simple morality play, an exhortation to use good manners by saying thank you to God. This runs the danger of trivializing the gospel, making it close to the parental injunction many of us heard as youngsters. Now, what do you say? Inviting the sing-song response, thank you. Now, gratitude is important, but it somehow misses the point. Only one commentator that I consulted called our gospel by this title, the Samaritan leper. Immediately, this title resonated. I said, yes, that's it. To appreciate the power, the boldness, and the challenge of this narrative, we must keep in mind two compounded social conditions. We have to have what we call today intersectional awareness. We need to account for both leprosy and Samaritanism, how they come together in Luke's gospel, and what Jesus's response tells us about who God is and who we are called to be. First, the condition of leprosy. While most scholars doubt that this affliction refers to what today we call Hansen's disease, we know that it was the biblical term given to a variety of severe skin disfigurements. We also know that it was viewed with dread, horror, even terror by our ancient forebears. Those who had this condition were banned from the community, forced to dwell outside the city gates. They had to wear tattered clothes that signaled their condition from afar and required them to warn all who approached by announcing that they were unclean, unclean. Forbidden to work, they were poor. Cast out from their homes, they were without shelter or the comfort of family. Reduced to begging from a distance, they were dependent on private kindness and charity. Banned from the synagogue and temple, they were exiled from the faith community. Considered cursed by God, they were religious and social pariahs, public failures, objects of both dread and pity. Simply put, they not only had a disease, they were diseased. Their very being was contaminated, indeed radioactive. Lepers lived in social and religious quarantine, apart, without touch and without love. Almost all of the Gospels narrate stories of Jesus healing lepers. Daring to draw near, Jesus risked his own social and religious contamination, showing God's concern for the most helpless and vulnerable. His actions declared that no one was so marked or disfigured they could not be restored to right relationship with the community. Those whom the community most feared with an almost irrational terror, those they most shamed, Jesus restored to faith and family. This was a sign of God's reign come among them, that even the most abandoned were welcomed back into table fellowship. The Messianic banquet is for all. Now let's consider the Samaritans. The gospel record bluntly states, quote, Jews and Samaritans have nothing to do with each other. It's hard for us to reconstruct the level of animosity and suspicion the two groups had for each other. The evidence we have comes mostly from the Jewish side. They despise Samaritans both ethnically and religiously. Many Jews considered them half-breeds of dubious and tainted ethnic mixture. This xenophobic hostility had such ancient roots that few living at the time of Jesus could account for exactly what went wrong with the Samaritan bloodline. But what was really clear was that the Samaritans had religious beliefs that were offensive to Jewish sensibilities. Among the most difficult was that the Samaritans did not recognize Jerusalem as the center of religious worship and God's presence. Rather, Mount Gerizim was their sacred space. But this denied the significance of the Ark of the Covenant, which was enshrined in Jerusalem's temple. The Ark, which led the people through the wilderness period and formed them into God's people, was of existential importance for Jewish religion. The Samaritans' refusal to acknowledge the profound dwelling place of God among human beings was a religious betrayal of catastrophic magnitude. The beliefs of these people were simply beyond the pale. In a caste-conscious society such as Israel, the Samaritans were reviled without peer or equal. Samaritan was a code word for all that was dishonorable. Unlike the lepers, the Samaritans rarely appear in the gospel accounts. Matthew and Mark point out that Jesus had to take laborious detours to avoid crossing into Samaritan territory. John relates a single dialogue that Jesus had with a Samaritan woman. Luke alone shows a particular fascination with them. They figure prominently in two gospel narratives. The first, the Good Samaritan, shocked his original hearers by having this heretical infidel held up as a model for emulation. And the second is today's gospel, also found only in Luke. Here, the only one of the 10 who were cured of their dreaded affliction, the only one who praised God with public testimony, the only one who raised his voice in unrestrained witness to the power of God, the God he wasn't even supposed to believe in, was the Samaritan. This was so unbelievable as to be considered impossible. Luke underscores how remarkable this is by calling him a foreigner. The Greek word is stronger, aliogentes, a word that appears only once in the entire gospel, indeed, only once in the whole New Testament, a word that literally means of another race, of another people, another breed of human. This is an outsider outside of normal humanity. This is the one who is held up as an example of authentic faith, not the so-called chosen people of Abraham. Luke is the only evangelist who has the Samaritans figured so prominently as eminent exemplars of faith. One commentator says that Luke is using the Samaritans to make the Jewish people jealous. This makes them rivals in a religious competition. It's like Jesus is saying, look at those Samaritans, the ones you despise, the heretical half-breeds. If they can do it, why can't you? You don't want to be outdone by them. I can hear my childhood taunts in the playground. You don't want to lose to a girl, or come on, you know a Jesuit's smarter than a Franciscan. God is not that petty. Luke's gospel is called the gospel of the outcast because here, as elsewhere in his gospel, a much more important point is being made. Faith and holiness are found far beyond human expectation. The incomparable power of faith is found among the most unlikely, unexpected, and shocking places and people. Human rivalries cannot contain or circumscribe the action of God. The Samaritan leper. This title tells us who God is and what God's reign is all about. The ultimate outsider is not only brought back to the community, but the one who has genuine faith. The despised and disdained, the ostracized and the humiliated are those who tell and witness to God's power, to God's care, to the expanse of God's love. The outsider, the aliogentes, is the person of faith, the bearer of good news. I believe it's not accidental or only a coincidence that I was invited to reflect upon this account for the Lectio. As some of you may know, I am public about being a member of the LGBTQ community. In my own being, I embody identities of race, sexuality, faith, and vocation that some, perhaps even many, would say are contradictory and cannot and should not belong together. Like biblical lepers, members of the LGBTQ community so often experience exile and banishment from their familial and faith homes. Loss of employment, stymied promotion, verbal harassment, violent bullying, despair even to the point of suicide. These markers attest to this community's estrangement because of the terror they arouse in so many. But like the Samaritan leper, the estrangement cuts deeper still to the realm of the spirit. Billy Porter, a Black gay actor and activist, was asked in an interview, "What's the worst thing anyone said to you?" He answered, "When I was young, my church community said I would never be blessed as long as I chose to be gay. And we know it's not a choice." Later, he expanded on these thoughts in another interview. "The first thing that's taken away from us as LGBTQ people is our spirituality, is God." I'm struck by how the worst thing that was said to him wasn't a racist insult or a sexual slur. It was being told that the only way God could accept him was if he denied his sexuality. It was being told that a core reality of his life was unacceptable to God. It was being told that the way he experiences and expresses love, the very thing that makes it possible for him to be in human relationships and in relationship to God, that very thing was defective. Sexuality is not something we can turn on or off. It's not something we perform only in genital acts. Sexuality is the life force within us that propels and enables us to be in relationship with others, ourselves, and with the mystery we call God. Porter reminds us of the almost irreparable harm done to those who are among today's Samaritan lepers, who are told they cannot image God. So often church spaces, church people, church authorities are occasions of public shaming, where our faith is considered suspect or lacking, our love is regarded as defective or delusional, our being seen as disordered, our loving as intrinsically evil. And yet the gospel today tells us that God's grace is not confined or constrained by human boundaries or religious understandings. The outsider, the alio gentes, is precisely where we ought to look for evidence of God's presence and action. Father Jim Martin, the Jesuit known for his work among the LGBTQ community, even Jesuits get it right once in a while, is fond of saying to them, God loves you, and the church is learning how to love you. Indeed, the church is learning slowly in fits and starts how to love those whom God already does. From Pope Francis's groundbreaking question, who am I to judge? To his message of welcome to Catholic LGBTQ ministers and activists this summer, to this Lectio session today, the Christian community is slowly coming to see the faith present already among those of us whom it has for too long misunderstood and cast out. One of my recent joys was working with a young student of mine, Ben. Now a senior, he just turned 21. He had the inspiration to compile a book of reflections from queer members of Fordham's University community. It's a book called Queer Prayer at Fordham. In the introduction, he writes, queer prayers gaze upon the divine from a unique perspective, providing new and extraordinary revelations about the divine mystery. In journeying to find ourselves, we see God from many angles, revealing a fullness that affirms God's eminence. Not bad for a 21-year-old. The Samaritan leper. The title for the gospel reminds us that God's holiness and love is found in and expressed by those whom our human and religious communities too often exclude. The Samaritan leper became the witness to the radical implications of God's expansive love. This is the bold summons, the challenge, and the good news for all of us. To remove the constraints on our imaginations and to dream anew of the wideness of God's boundless love. As I conclude in my own preface to this book, we hope these prayers and thoughts help create a world where people like us will no longer be told that the loving, infinite mystery does not and cannot embrace us all. Let the church say, amen.